in my video and to have me make a video specially to answer your question, send me an email to englishclubusa@yahoo.com, and you can visit my website at englishclubusa.com for a free life membership. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell. Well, today we will speak about something that gives many difficulties to everybody who speaks Spanish. I'm not familiar with other languages, but there's no question that levels of familiarity with places and people and other things is always a problem for anyone who is learning English. So let's see, today, in just a few short minutes, you will become a thinker just like a native speaker. So the most popular word in English language when you want to describe that you have knowledge of something is the word know. And that word is the most badly used word in English language when we are trying to describe knowledge. So let's take a look and see how we can use the idea of knowledge or the idea of familiarity with something or someone in English language. Let's take a look at the first example. The first level, when you're talking about familiarity, you frequently are talking about visual information. Well, visual information, you may talk about a person or a thing, or you may talk about a place. So what is the level of your familiarity? How well do you know something? So when you are talking about a person or a thing, when you say that you had a chance to meet someone for a very short time, but you have no idea who they are, you just saw them. So the way to explain the very small level of familiarity is to refer to the visual information. So you don't say that I know Valerio. You cannot. What you can do is you can say I saw Valerio in the videos. That means you don't know anything about the videos. You don't know anything about Valerio. You just saw the face. You have very little level of familiarity. So what happens when you visited a place? If you just passed by in the airport, or maybe you stayed for a night or two, what is your level of familiarity with New York? Probably not very much. So whenever you're talking about a level which is extremely small, you cannot say that I know New York. What you can say that I was in New York. So that, if you remember verbs to be, that right there is talking about nothing more than a fact in the point in time when you were in New York. Let's look at the second level, which is a little bit more, that also has to do with visual information. So when you now have had a chance to meet me, to have a little chat, and you know a little about who I am, what I do, how is my family, what do I like to do, so we are acquainted personally. Now what you can say that I met Valerio at a party. So that means we had a talk, we drink, we had a good time. You are somewhat familiar with me. So you cannot say that I know Valerio, okay? You cannot do that, but when you use the word I met Valerio, all native speakers understand that you had a chance to have a conversation with me. What happens if you visited New York City for a few days or a few times? Now you have much more familiarity than you had when you just were there for a day or two. So when you went to the museums and you went to the restaurants and you took the subway and you enjoyed the Manhattan, you probably went to a different barrio like Brooklyn or Queens. Now you have a much greater familiarity with the city. So now you don't say that I was in New York, because if you say I was in New York, I understand that you know nothing about New York. But if you spend some time in New York, if you were there for maybe a week or two, or were a few times in New York, there's no question you are now familiar with New York, but not very familiar, maybe a little familiar. So the little familiar is when you're talking about a place that would be visited. So when you say that I visited Miami, that doesn't mean that you were there for a day or two. That doesn't mean that you were there. It means you know nothing in a day or two. But if you went on a vacation for a few days, or you've been to Miami a few days, now you can say that I visited Miami a few days. What happens if you are very familiar with Valeria? And very familiar, that means there's no question that we had a few discussions. You may be a friend, you may be a neighbor. So in that case, you can use the word familiar, but you must justify, how do I function in your life? How did you get to be familiar with me? So the way to do it is you have to identify my function so that the audience, the native speakers, will understand exactly what you're talking about. You cannot say that I know Valerio, but what you can say is I am familiar with Valerio. And then you have to identify what was the function of your familiarity. So when you watch my videos, you are familiar with me as a teacher. What about New York? It's the same thing. If you live in New York, that means you are familiar with New York very well. You know at least 10% or more about New York. So now you haven't visited New York. By living in New York, that doesn't mean anything about familiarity. But if you say I am familiar with New York City, that means that I can ask you a question and you will probably give me the answer I want. But then the question is, what about no? Is there a time to ask or to say anything using the word no? And yes, there is. That is why so many people do not use the word no, because they're trying to express all of that we just heard until now using the word no. And not one native English speaker will ever use the word no until now. So when is the time to use the word no? So when you are familiar with somebody or something, at least 80% and probably more, that means you know basically just about everything there is to know about someone or something. Now you can say that I know Valerio very well. Often when you say I know Valerio very well, it is a good practice to do what you did in the previous example. So if you know Valerio very well, then you say an explanation. You tell me that you are my neighbor or you lived next to me for 25 years. So now I will understand your level of familiarity. So in fact, if you and I were neighbors for 25 years or 30 years, there's no question that you know me pretty well. You may not know everything about me, but you've seen me for a long time. What about a place? Who knows New York very well? Who can say that I know New York City? And generally, when you use the word know, it follows with an adverb very well. Two adverbs. So when you say I know you in New York City very well, that means who are you? You're a police officer. You're a firefighter. You're an ambulance driver. You're a taxi driver. You are a limousine driver. You are somebody who has been working, moving from one place to New York and the other, like delivery people. They are the only ones can possibly say they know New York. So even if I lived all my life, let's say in Atlanta, and I am familiar with Atlanta very well, I still cannot say that I know Atlanta, even after more than 30 years. And I am familiar with Atlanta very well, but I am not familiar with Atlanta more than 80%. So even after 30 years of living in the same city and having excellent familiarity with certain parts of the city, I can still not say that I know Atlanta very well. What I can say that I am familiar with Atlanta very well. And that will be the limit of my familiarity. So when do you ask, when can you possibly use the word no? Well, that is very commonly used in the form of a question. Because when you ask a question, you are expecting a yes or no answer. So when you ask, do you know who did it? I'm being very specific. I'm asking you about the person. If I say, do you know what he did? I'm being specific. I want to know exactly what he did. If I say, do you know when he did it? I'm being specific. I'm not being general, I'm being very specific. That's why you have to use the word now. If you say, do you know how long something takes? You either know it or you don't. So this is why the word no is so useful. And if you say, do you know why somebody did it? That's a specific reason. If you say, do you know when somebody did it? That's a specific time. If you know where somebody is, that's a specific location. And if you're asking, do you know whose watch this is? You're asking me if I know the specific person to whom that watch belongs. So this is what you use the levels of familiarity for. So let's take a look at the other examples that will help us out. Well, not everything we do has to do with visual information. While visual information is definitely the most important information for us people, in addition to visual information, we also hear things. As you're aware that dogs, for example, do not have a very good eyesight. But what they do, they have excellent hearing, or they have excellent sense of smell. But we do not have a very good sense of smell. What we rely on are visual and hearing information. So again, level of familiarity that when it has to do with the word no, may also have something to do with hearing. So let's take a look and see how auditory information has to do with our levels of familiarity. So whenever you are familiar with Valerio, but you are not familiar very well, you haven't met, you haven't spoken, you haven't heard about lecture, you have limited information, all you have to do is, I have heard about Valerio's video homework. So somebody told you, and that little information is the only level of familiarity that you have. And that means that you have heard, means until now, there's a video on that. Preposition about means not specific. So that means you're familiar until now. Not specific, nothing specific, but a more general, that video homework exists. I heard about the new Hyundai. Some people say I heard of the new Hyundai, and you can probably use both of them, and we will talk about that in videos that have to do with prepositions. But the people say that I either heard of the new Hyundai or I heard about the new Hyundai. That means that they have very little level of information. What happens when there is quite a bit of information? Is there a situation like that? Well, absolutely. And that is when you have, I never saw Valerio, but I am familiar with his methods. That means that you may never saw videos, but someone explained to you the idea that Valerio says that prepositions and verbs are the most important thing in English language. And if you can manage well both the world of prepositions and the world of verbs, then there's no question you will understand English very well. So those are my methods to make sure that everybody can think like a native speaker. And then if you have heard about my methods, then you are familiar with them. You have a pretty high level of familiarity without actually seeing and listening to the video classes. So I never saw the new Hyundai, but I'm familiar with it. That means that people talked about it. They explained the differences between the old Hyundai and the new Hyundai, and you understand what those differences are. So you are familiar with the old Hyundai, you know what the differences are with the new Hyundai, so now you can definitely say that I'm familiar with the new Hyundai, even though you never saw it. What about music? Often we talk about music, and we sometimes can say something about a song. So if you heard the song, that means you have very little level of familiarity. Or if you love the song, you have a very high level of familiarity. So if you say, oh, I know the song. Why? Because you love the song. Okay? You are very familiar with the words, with the singer, with the time when it was made. You know a lot about that song. That's perfectly fine. I know this song. Or when you went to the concert, let's say classical music, you say, oh, I know the concert very well. So you have to have a very high level of familiarity. So what happens when the place, what about people, what about things that you don't actually see, that you only hear? It works exactly the same way. So you may say that I never been to Miami, but I have heard of New York, or I am familiar with New York because you studied it. The information that you read is very similar to the ones that you hear, or you know New York very well. Okay, that's only when you have enough visual information to cover at least 80%. So, I hope you understood and enjoyed the video on no. I hope that you are very careful in using no, because if you want to let somebody else know that you think just like an English speaker, you need to make sure that you need to use the word no carefully. So I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I hope to see you next time. To be in my video and to have me make a video specially to answer your question, send me an email to englishclubusa@yahoo.com, and you can visit my website at englishclubusa.com for a free live membership. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell.